The stage was set. Bright studio lights illuminated the sleek, modern set of American Perspectives Tonight, a primetime show renowned for its heated debates on politics and culture. At the center of it all sat Karoline Leavitt, a rising political firebrand. Her posture was poised, her expression composed. Across from her, Alan Brooks, a seasoned journalist, infamous for his sharp, unfiltered, and relentless questioning. Millions were watching. The tension in the studio was palpable. The debate was advertised as a discussion on leadership and policy, but everyone knew it would be much more than that. Karoline had built a reputation for standing firm in her beliefs, never shying away from difficult conversations. Alan, on the other hand, was known for cornering his guests, exposing what he believed to be flaws in their arguments. For the first 20 minutes, the exchange followed the usual rhythm: economic policies, government regulations, social issues. Karoline responded with confidence, her words precise and well-prepared. She wasn't just a politician, she was a skilled communicator, adept at connecting with audiences far beyond the studio walls. Then, Alan shifted in his chair. A slight narrowing of his eyes, a subtle movement only an experienced debater would notice. He was about to make it personal. The energy in the room changed. The producers, camera operators, and even the audience sensed it. Karoline, Alan began, his voice measured. You often speak about your faith as a guiding principle in your leadership. You've even said it should play a role in shaping public policy. She nodded, waiting. But let's be honest, he continued, leaning forward. Religion, Christianity in particular, is declining in this country. More people than ever reject the idea of a higher power. Science has given us answers that religion never could. And yet you continue to advocate for faith as if it's some universal truth. A murmur rippled through the audience. Karoline remained still. She let the question settle. Alan wasn't just challenging her personal beliefs, he was questioning the relevance of faith itself. There are millions, Alan pressed on, who see faith as nothing more than an outdated crutch, something that holds people back rather than moves them forward. Do you think that's fair? Or are you simply unwilling to admit that faith is losing its place in modern America? The room felt tighter. People shifted in their seats. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of emotion. Alan had thrown a match into a dry field. Now everyone was waiting to see if Karoline would let it burn, or extinguish it with something unexpected. But she didn't rush to answer. She took a breath, tilted her head slightly, and gave a small, almost imperceptible smile, because she knew exactly what to say next. Alan leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. The audience held their breath. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was electric. Karoline let the moment linger. You say faith is an outdated crutch, she said, her voice steady. That it holds people back. But let me ask you something, Alan. She met his gaze. What? Do people turn to when science doesn't have an answer? Alan's lips twitched, but he remained silent. She continued. It's easy to dismiss faith when life is comfortable, when everything makes sense, when your job is secure, when your family is healthy, when the world is predictable. But when the ground beneath you disappears, when your child is dying in a hospital bed, when you're standing at a gravesite, when the doctors say there's nothing more they can do, what do you reach for then? The room was silent. Even the producers, usually whispering behind the cameras, were frozen. Alan adjusted his tie but didn't break eye contact. People turn to faith because they're desperate, he countered. That doesn't make it real. It makes it comforting. Karoline nodded slightly as if she had anticipated his response. Comfort is not a weakness, she said. It's human. And faith is more than just comfort. It's resilience. It's hope. It's the belief that, even in the darkest moments, there's still meaning, she paused, then added, You can call that naive, but I'd argue it's the very thing that has kept people from collapsing under the weight of suffering for thousands of years. Alan exhaled through his nose, shifting in his chair. So, you're saying belief is necessary for survival? Karoline's expression remained steady. I'm saying belief is what makes survival worth something. Alan smiled faintly, shaking his head. You're good, Karoline. He gestured slightly, resetting the conversation. But let's talk facts. He leaned forward. Religious institutions have been responsible for some of the worst atrocities in history. Wars, oppression, corruption. And yet you defend faith as if it's only ever been a force for good. Karoline didn't flinch. I won't deny that people have done terrible things in the name of religion. But let's be fair. Faith has also inspired some of the greatest acts of courage, sacrifice, and kindness the world has ever seen. She held his gaze. The abolition of slavery, the civil rights movement, the hospitals, schools, and charities built by people who believed their faith called them to serve others. You can't erase that just because some have twisted faith for their own agendas. Alan sat back studying her. He didn't have an immediate retort. Karoline leaned in slightly. But if you really want to know why I believe in faith, why I defend it, it's not because of history. It's not because of politics. She paused. It's because of a woman I met 12 years ago. A slight furrow appeared between Alan's brows. A woman? Karoline nodded, her voice softening just slightly. Her name was Margaret, and she taught me something about faith that no debate could ever shake. The room was silent. Karoline rested her hands on the table, fingers lightly interlaced. She didn't rush. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, more deliberate. 12 years ago, I was fresh out of college, working as a legislative assistant in Nashville. My days were filled with meetings, calls, and policy statements. Politics was everything to me back then. I thought policy was the most powerful force in the world. Then I met Margaret. Alan remained silent, posture rigid. The audience leaned in, not because of theatrics, but because something real was unfolding. Margaret was 72 years old. I met her at a community outreach event for seniors, one of those initiatives politicians love for a quick photo op. But I wasn't there for that. I was just doing my job. I was supposed to take notes, listen politely, and leave. Karoline let out a small breath, as if the memory pressed against her. But Margaret, she stopped me in my tracks. She hesitated for just a second, then continued. She had a presence about her, not because she was loud or commanding. She was actually soft-spoken. But when she talked, people listened. She carried this quiet strength, the kind that only comes from surviving things that should have broken you. Alan's expression was unreadable, but he wasn't looking at his notes anymore. He was listening. She told me she had buried 2 sons, one to cancer, one to a drunk driver. She lost her husband to a stroke. She had no siblings, no close family left, and yet she sat across from me, smiling, sipping tea, asking how my life was going. Karoline's voice tightened just for a second. I remember asking her how she did it, how she could endure so much loss and still sit there warm and kind, as if the world hadn't tried to take everything from her. She looked at Alan now, not as an opponent, but as someone she was simply speaking to. She told me something I will never forget. Karoline swallowed, then continued. She said, "Faith isn't about proof. It's about what keeps you standing when there is no proof." Silence. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to fade into the background. She told me that every morning she woke up and thanked God, not because life had been easy, not because she had been spared suffering, but because she was still here. Because even after everything, she believed there was still purpose in the day she had left. Karoline exhaled slowly. I was 22 years old and I thought I understood strength, but Margaret showed me what it really looked like. She paused. And that's when I realized, faith isn't just something people hold on to when they're desperate. It's the very thing that keeps them from falling apart. The words settled. Alan blinked, opening his mouth slightly as if to respond, but then shut it again. Before he could find the right words, Karoline added something that changed. Everything and no one, not Alan, not the audience, was prepared for what she said next. The weight of Karoline's story hung in the air, pressing down on everyone in the studio. The audience, normally quick to react, to whisper, to shift in their seats, was utterly still. Even the host, always eager to keep the conversation moving, hesitated. Karoline didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch. Alan finally cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. "That's a powerful story," he admitted, his voice quieter than before. "But don't you think that's all it is? A story?" He leaned forward slightly. "Margaret found something that worked for her. That doesn't mean faith is some universal truth." Karoline met his gaze, unsurprised. She gave a small nod, as if she had anticipated this. "You're right about one thing," she said. "Faith isn't about proving something to other people. It's about what people live through, and if you really listen, you'll hear that same story told a million different ways." Alan exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "But that's exactly my issue," he countered. "Faith isn't measurable. It's built on emotions, experiences, things that can't be quantified. And yet people use it to justify decisions that affect everyone." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "You mean like hope?" Alan blinked. "What?" "Hope," she repeated. "It's not measurable. It's not scientific. You can't prove it exists in any tangible way. And yet people fight wars for it. They survive the impossible because of it. They hold on to it even when logic says they shouldn't." She let the words settle before continuing. "Would you tell someone who just lost their home in a tornado that their hope is just an emotional crutch, that their belief in something better isn't real because it can't be put under a microscope?" Alan shifted in his chair again, but he didn't interrupt. "That's the thing about faith," Karoline said. "It's not about controlling people. It's not about forcing a belief on anyone. It's about how people make sense of the hardest parts of life. You can call it irrational, but when someone loses everything and still gets up the next day, still finds the strength to keep going, there's something in that, something you can't measure, but you also can't ignore." Alan's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. His usual sharpness had softened. He wasn't just debating anymore. He was thinking. The host, sensing the shift, finally spoke. "Alan, do you have a response to that?" Alan opened his mouth, then closed it. He glanced toward the audience, as if searching for a reaction to ground himself. But no one spoke. No one moved. When he finally answered, his voice lacked its earlier edge. "I think..." He hesitated. "I think I need to process that." A murmur rippled through the audience. It wasn't the dramatic rebuttal they had been expecting. It wasn't an explosive takedown or a definitive win. It was something far more rare. A moment of honesty. But the real reaction, the one that would send shockwaves across the country, was still to come. The debate wrapped up moments later, but the conversation was far from over. The usual applause that followed closing statements was hesitant, uncertain. The audience wasn't walking away with just another political soundbite. They had felt something, and that wasn't easy to shake. Alan gave Karoline a small nod before removing his mic and stepping off stage. He didn't linger for small talk or post-show commentary. Instead, he walked straight toward the exit, his posture stiff, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Karoline, however, remained seated for a moment longer. She could hear the whispers from the crew, see the way the audience exchanged glances. Some looked moved. Others looked unsettled. But no one looked unaffected. Then the moment the cameras cut, the first wave hit. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Messages, missed calls, notifications piling up. Social media had exploded. Clips of the exchange were already circulating, dissected frame by frame. But what shocked Karoline the most wasn't just the reaction from her usual supporters, it was the response from the other side. I don't consider myself religious, but what she said really made me think. I've never heard someone defend faith without attacking the other side. That was different. This wasn't about politics. This was about something bigger. Comment after comment, post after post. People weren't just reacting. They were listening. Her team was already in motion, scrambling to respond to media requests. But Karoline knew. This moment wasn't something that could be managed. It was already out there and it wasn't going away. Within the hour, news outlets were running bold headlines. Karoline Leavitt leaves journalists speechless. A rare debate moment. No one saw coming. Did this conversation just shift the debate on faith in America? Even late-night talk shows, often quick to mock conservative figures, were covering it. But this time there was no punchline, no ridicule. Just genuine discussion. And then there was Alan. He remained silent for the rest of the night. No tweets, no interviews, no follow-up commentary. A stark contrast to his usual strategy, controlling the narrative before it could control him. But now, nothing. Until the next morning. At exactly 8:37 a.m., he broke his silence with a single post. I've been in journalism for over 30 years. Last night was the first time I walked away from an interview realizing I had more questions than answers. That was it. No grand statement, no damage control. Just honesty. And that was all it took to set off another tidal wave. But the true impact wouldn't be clear until days later. In the days that followed, the conversation only grew. What had started as a standard political debate had transformed into something deeper, something people had been hesitant to admit for years. People were searching for something more. It became impossible to scroll through the internet without seeing the debate dissected from every angle. Podcasters, columnists, and commentators all weighed in. Some called it a defining moment for faith in public discourse. Others called it a wake-up call. But the most surprising reactions came from the most unexpected places. A well-known comedian, famous for ridiculing religion, admitted on his podcast, "Look, I still don't believe in God, but that woman made me wish I did." And that's saying something. A prominent scientist tweeted, "Faith and science don't have to be enemies. Last night I was reminded why so many still hold on to belief, even in the face of uncertainty." And then came the emails. Karoline's inbox had always been full: supporters, critics, and the occasional political request. But now she was hearing from people who didn't fit into any of those categories. One email stood out. A woman named Rebecca wrote, "I haven't stepped foot in a church in 20 years. I lost my faith a long time ago, but after watching your debate, I sat in my car and cried, not because I suddenly found God or had some dramatic revelation, but because I realized something. I miss believing in something bigger than myself. I didn't even know how much until last night. Thank you for making me think." Karoline read the email twice, then a third time. She had spent her career in politics, fighting for policies, debating laws, but this was different. This wasn't about winning an argument. It wasn't about securing votes. This was about something that couldn't be measured in polls or political victories. It was about a conversation people had been too afraid to have, and Rebecca wasn't alone. Over the next few weeks, stories poured in. People shared their own Margarets, their grandmothers, their neighbors, the stranger in the hospital waiting room who had whispered words of faith when they needed them most. This wasn't about proving one side right and the other wrong. It wasn't about conversions or ideological victories. It was about reminding people that faith, whether in God, in humanity, or in something yet to be understood, wasn't weakness. It was what kept people standing. And that realization? That was something no debate could ever erase. As the buzz around the debate began to settle, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another political moment. It wouldn't be forgotten in a news cycle. It wouldn't be lost in the endless noise of internet discourse. It was a reminder that no matter how divided people seemed, no matter how loudly the world shouted that faith was outdated, unnecessary, or obsolete, there were still people searching for meaning, searching for something beyond the tangible. Karoline had never set out to change minds that night. She had simply told a story. But sometimes a story is all it takes. And if this one made you think, if it stirred something in you, don't let it end here. Keep asking questions. Keep searching. Keep listening. because sometimes the answers we're looking for don't come from winning an argument. They come from the conversations we never expected to have.